Okay. Okay, I just have one item for all of you at the top, a week ahead. This weekend, including President's Day, on Monday, the President will remain in D.C. Throughout, obviously at the White House. Throughout next week, the President will continue close coordination with our allies and partners on Russia's potential further invasion of Ukraine. On Tuesday, the President will host an event announcing progress on restoring critical supply chains, powering clean energy manufacturing, and creating good-paying jobs. And on Thursday, the President will participate in a virtual G7 leaders meeting to discuss the ongoing situation with regard to Russia and Ukraine and priorities of the German G7 presidency this year. With that, I will try to jump around as much as I can. Josh, you want to kick us off, though?
Great, thanks, Jen. Two questions. First, has the President read the Russian response on Ukraine? And is he giving any consideration to mobilizing additional troops in Europe?
Well, on the first part, I know that, as you all know, our Secretary of State has accepted the invitation to have a meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov, or engage with him next Wednesday. And certainly we are continuing to review. In terms of the President's status or process there, I don't have anything to update you on. We have always said from the beginning that we are open to sending more troops should that be needed, but I don't have any update on that front. I would point you to the Department of Defense.
And then secondly, real quick, separatists in Ukraine are evacuating civilians to Russia. Secretary Blinken warned about this as a type of false flag operation. Now that you're seeing these operations, does that mean a further invasion is forthcoming, if not inevitable?
Well, I would first say that we continue to believe, as you heard our Secretary of State say yesterday, that Russia is positioned to attack Ukraine in the coming days. And that remains the case. Just what the Secretary said yesterday, obviously the President will be speaking shortly to all of you. At the same time, the door to diplomacy remains open, and it will continue to remain open. And again, as is evidenced by the fact that our Secretary of State is planning to engage with the foreign minister. But in terms of these reports, yes, it is a good example of what we're seeing, or what we have long anticipated or long predicted for all of you, that the Russians would take part in pretexts or steps that would lay a predicate for either war or to create confusion or spread misinformation on the ground about what's actually happening on the ground. I think it's important to remember that we would consider Eastern Ukraine, that the war began in Eastern Ukraine back in 2014. We're not waiting. It's already began back in 2014. There have been Russian separatists there. There have been efforts to spread misinformation and to create these pretexts for some time now. But certainly we continue to watch closely. Go ahead.
Is it wise for President Zelensky to leave Ukraine to attend the Munich conference?
That is a decision for him to make, but regardless of what decision he makes, he will find a strong partner in the United States.
And what does the President want to hear from the transatlantic? I think the call's going on right now. What is he going to talk about? Sanctions? What are they going to talk about?
I think you have all seen the President engage quite a bit, extensively, I should say, in conversations, video conferences, calls with his counterparts around the world to ensure we remain lockstep and coordinated and united. And that doesn't happen on its own. It happens through a lot of work and effort and a lot of direction by the President of the United States. So this is an effort to have a conversation with his counterparts about what we're seeing, where things stand, and continue that close coordination that has been ongoing for months now. Go ahead.
One question. There was a readout from Brett and Amos's meeting in the Middle East, and in that readout it says they discussed with the Saudis a collaborative approach to managing potential market pressures if Russia invades. Can you give any details? Was anything concrete agreed to? Were there any promises made? What does a collaborative approach mean when it comes to the Saudis in the U.S.?
Well, I would say a collaborative approach means trying to prevent impacts on the energy markets if there is a shortage as a result of an invasion. There are lots of ways to achieve that, and that was certainly part of the discussion, but I don't have any more details beyond what was in the readout. I would also note that in the readout, they also conveyed that a big part of their discussion was also related to Yemen, also related to Iran, so there are a range of topics that were discussed.
And just to clarify, is this the beginning of that discussion about a potential collaborative approach, midway through, close to a final agreement?
We expect certainly our conversations with the Saudis will be ongoing, and the effort will be focused on ensuring that we're in full coordination to handle any energy market pressures that could arise. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. We heard from President Biden yesterday. He had not yet read the written response from the Russians. Assuming that he has now, has that changed his assessment at all about the possibility of diplomacy?
I think Josh asked a similar question, but I would just say I don't have an update on the internal discussions about the Russian response, other than to convey that, as our Secretary of State noted yesterday, he has accepted the offer to, or he will be engaging, I should say, with his Russian counterpart on Wednesday, unless, of course, they invade, and there will continue to be a range of diplomatic discussions. I think the Secretary of State was also very clear yesterday about the fact that we believe that Russia is positioned to attack Ukraine. They, of course, could change their mind, or they could decide not to, and we are going to keep the door to diplomacy open, as we should. But again, there's no new assessment beyond what the Secretary of State said yesterday, which was quite forward-leaning, as I think you would all agree. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. Has the U.S. in any way conveyed to Ukraine that it should not respond to the provocations by Russia? We're obviously seeing the increased shelling that's happening right now.
And they have not, I think, as you have seen. I think we have been speaking vocally and privately, of course, about our expectation of these types of provocations, and what their intended purpose is. I mean, whether their intended purpose is to create confusion, whether it is to create irritation, whether it is to prompt a response, obviously that would not be a positive step at this point in
And
time.
so you have conveyed that privately to the
We
Ukrainians?
have conveyed that certainly in a range of ways.
Okay, and let me just, if I could, go back to the meeting between the Secretary of State and Lavrov that may happen next week. What gives the administration hope that there's still a path for diplomacy when the president has said that an invasion is all but certain to happen in the next few days?
Well, we hope we're wrong. We hope that if Russia doesn't invade, we will be relieved. That would certainly be a good outcome. But at the same time, what's the alternative? Us not to say, well, we will agree to diplomacy or diplomatic opportunities?
Any assurances from Russian officials that they won't invade until Lavrov meets with Secretary Blinken?
Again, Kristen, I think as we've said in the past, I mean, it's not just about what is said. They've said that publicly. It's about what they do. And so we continue to believe that they are positioned to invade Ukraine. If they decide not to, that is certainly a positive step. And we have a responsibility to the global community, to Ukrainians, to leave the door to diplomacy open.
If I could try one more time on Zelensky, we do have reporting that a number of administration officials are concerned about him leaving at this critical moment. Obviously, he's also scheduled to meet with the vice president. Has anyone in this administration conveyed directly to Zelensky that there are concerns about him leaving right now?
I'm just not going to detail any private diplomatic conversations, but again, I'd reiterate, it's a decision that is up to him to make. Is what we convey privately as well, and regardless of what decision he makes, he will remain. He will have the support of the United States. Go ahead.
On the Blinken-Lavrov meeting, does the administration see this as a precursor to some kind of leaders' summit, or perhaps a phone call between the president and Putin, or a face-to-face meeting?
Well, I think where we are right now is that, we're unclear. We're ready to engage in diplomacy, but it's unclear if the Russians are going to sit down in good faith. And of course, if while we are doing everything we can to prevent war, and including having the Secretary of State willing to engage further with his Russian counterpart, I don't think we can get ahead of the process or ahead of where things stand, which is our continued belief that they are positioned to attack Ukraine.
And President Bolsonaro of Brazil met with Putin this week in Moscow. He expressed solidarity with Russia. I know the State Department put something out, but did the president feel betrayed by President Bolsonaro's comments, and does this affect U.S.-Brazilian relations at all?
I've not discussed his comments with the president, but what I would say is that the vast majority of the global community is united in their view, shared view, that invading another country, attempting to take some of their land, terrorizing their people, is certainly not aligned with global values. And so I think Brazil may be on the other side of where the majority of the global community stands. Go ahead.
There's a report in Foreign Policy magazine that Russia intends to target Ukrainian politicians and dissidents for assassination or arrest. Are you aware of any plans to provide security for President Zelensky or others?
I've seen those reports. We've seen those reports, and I can't, of course, speak to intelligence matters or hypotheticals. We would be very concerned about any actions that would target political critics or vulnerable populations, as I think is what that report is conveying, if I'm correct, such as religious and ethnic minorities or LGBTQ persons. We have in the past seen Russia try to force acquiescence through intimidation and repression. But given it's hypothetical and I can't speak to it further, I can't give you any prediction of security assistance.
I want to ask you a question about gas prices specifically. Can you explain, if there is any, the reticence to embrace the calls for the gas tax holiday?
Well, we've said every option is on the table, including that, but a decision has not been made.
Is there any reticence here to do that?
I don't know if that's called reticence. It's just that a decision hasn't been made in a process yet. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. Just a quick follow-up on the Russian response. Has the president reviewed it yet?
Again, I don't have any update on that. What I can tell you is that our efforts remain having continued diplomatic conversations with our counterparts in Russia, as is evidenced by the Secretary of State's plans for next Wednesday, unless they, of course, invade, and the president's engagements that he is a part of at this point in time. But I think it's important to note that when we look at how we're going to engage in diplomacy, it's also important that we look at how Russia is responding, right? And Russia's threats of war, if their demands aren't met, are inconsistent with diplomacy. So we are going to leave the door open, but I think the Secretary of State's commitment to or openness to meeting or to engaging with his counterpart is evidence of that.
And I know you got a question on the call that's happening as we speak, probably with the transatlantic leaders. Just on the president's framing of this, does he see this as getting the allies on the same page as a final check-in before an anticipated invasion, given that he said he's expecting it within the next several days?
It's a part of our ongoing engagement, so I wouldn't put it in those terms. We are united. We are with our allies. I think you will hear him convey that when he speaks to all of you shortly. But it is also important to stay in close touch. I wouldn't say this is the last time he's going to talk with them or talk with these counterparts in the coming days at all. He's been talking with his counterparts nearly every single day. But with the point we're at right now is, of course, over the last few days, we've seen reports of rapid uptick of violations of the ceasefire agreement, including the shelling of a Ukrainian kindergarten yesterday. More and more disinformation is being pushed out to the public. We know this is consistent with the playbook for invasion, and we believe they are positioned to attack. So, of course, it's an important moment to have a conversation with his counterparts, but I would expect those to be ongoing. Go ahead.
Did you accidentally leave off of the week ahead the president's interviews of Supreme Court candidates?
Very good. I was like, I'm thinking maybe I left something off. Well, I can tell you that February is not that much longer. It's 10 days, if my math is correct, and we remain on track to make an announcement about a Supreme Court, the president's selection for a qualified and credible nominee to serve on the Supreme Court before the end of the month.
Okay, and then that was my following question,
Go ahead.
which is that given what seems poised to go on with Ukraine, is there any thought that if there is an invasion, the president would delay the announcement of the Supreme Court pick, given what else could be going on at the time?
Well, you know I love hypotheticals, but what I will tell you is that he has every intention of making a decision this month. He's on track to do so. That will mean he will have chosen a nominee faster than any Democratic president in decades. And obviously he's somebody who has to, as leader of the free world and president of the United States, conduct business on a number of fronts at the same time. Go ahead.
Yes, jumping off of that, actually, yesterday in the briefing it was mentioned that the president was planning to begin interviewing nominees as soon as this week. Given that we are on Friday, can you confirm if he did or did not interview anybody this week?
I'm just not going to provide you a day-to-day update, but I can tell you that this is not going to be that much longer lasting because we only have 10 more days left of the month. So that's the good news. And it is always a late part of the process, the interviews. But I'm not going to be able to give you an update on that from here.
One other thing, on COVID, I believe that only 4, maybe 5 states still have indoor mask mandates as it holds right now. And I know that you all have been saying you're going to follow the CDC's guidance. But is there a point where the CDC's guidance is out of step with a vast majority of what states across the country are doing? And how do you all reconcile that?
Well, what I can tell you is the CDC guidance follows data and science. And data and science moves at the speed of data and science. You can speak to any local leaders about what their decision making has been based on, and we certainly respect their right to do that and respect their role in making decisions about their communities. But we've said that the CDC is reviewing the guidance. They have been doing that, and they're going to base any recommendations they make on science.
The assumption, though, that Democratic governors and Republican governors in all these states are not basing decisions on data and science?
I can't speak for how they're making their decisions. I can speak for how we make our decisions from the federal government, which is to base it on data and science. And the CDC is the federal government's entity where we have all of our data and science housed. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. The former Minneapolis or suburban Minneapolis police officer who was convicted of fatally shooting Dante Wright was sentenced to 2 years in prison today. Is the president keeping track of this? Is he aware of this sentence, and does he think that this was a sentence that was fitting for this crime?
Well, what I can say is that Dante Wright should be here with his family and loved ones, and his death was the tragic result of a law enforcement officer's error. We know we have a long way to go when it comes to criminal justice and racial equity in this country. That's why we are committed to not only engaging conversations about meaningful policing reform, but we also continue to ensure that the law enforcement agencies have the resources they need to properly train and equip officers to protect our communities. But I'm not going to speak to the specifics of the sentencing outcome.
And then one more on the State of the Union, which is obviously right around the corner.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what specifically the president is doing to prepare for that, what tone he is hoping to set in that speech, what message he's hoping to send to the country?
I expect we will have more as we get a little bit closer. I will say that as the president is in Washington, D.C. this weekend at the White House, he will, of course, be closely monitoring developments in Ukraine, but he will also be, working toward finalizing his decision-making process as it relates to a Supreme Court justice nominee, and certainly preparing for the State of the Union as well. So I expect as we get a little bit closer next week, we'll have more to say. Go ahead.
Back on Russia, Ukraine, the US language seems to have changed from imminent to highly likely back to imminent again. Is that because you're trying to second guess Vladimir Putin all the time, or were you closer to the escalation at one point?
I would say that several weeks ago, I think for maybe a day, we used the word imminent, and we believed we sent the wrong message that was not intended. Our intended message we were sending at that time was that it was an option, or he was prepared to. Obviously, things have developed since then. We've seen a rapid uptick of violations of the ceasefire agreement. We've seen an increase in troops building at the border, and certainly we've seen an escalatory actions. That's why our Secretary of State went to the United Nations yesterday. So what we're seeing is further progress, further aggression over the last several days. Go ahead.
2 questions. One, back to Congress. As you know, Senate Republicans are blocking Federal Reserve nominees and other nominees. They argue that they don't think those Federal Reserve delays have any actual effect. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would say at a time where I think most people agree that inflation and costs are the top, if not one of the top issues for every American in the country, the argument that it wouldn't be best to have a fully confirmed full Federal Reserve Board just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Then on Ukraine and the idea of cyber attacks on Ukraine, can you speak to the idea of those attacks, the effect they could have on neighboring NATO countries like Poland, and whether that kind of effect could trigger Article 5 under NATO protections or not? Does a cyber attack affecting NATO countries include the kind of language we see in the NATO defense corporate deal?
I think I'm just not going to get into a hypothetical on that front. Obviously, they have a range of capacities. We work in lockstep with our NATO partners, but I'm not going to get ahead of any intended actions. Go ahead, Jackie.
Thanks, Jen. On the attempted murder of a Louisville mayoral candidate, the man who was charged with this was released on bail a couple days after this happened with the assistance of a bail fund group. Knowing that the vice president has in the past supported bail fund groups, what's the White House reaction to this case, and should there be restrictions on which cases these bail fund groups can help, given this is an attempted murder?
I would have to dig into this further, Jackie, and I'm happy to do that after the briefing.
Ukraine, the sanctions we've learned don't include SWIFT. They don't target energy, so the impacts to other countries are mitigated. You guys have attributed this cyber attack to Russia, and you're warning that the prospect of war is, or peace rather, is pretty dim. So at what point do you break away from the strategy, say it's not working, and do something else, impose some of these sanctions now?
Well, I think as we've talked about a little bit in here, our collective view from our national security team is that sanctions are meant to be a deterrent. They are not, if you put all of the sanctions in place now, what is stopping them from invading? Are they working? Well, again, Jackie, I think that's our assessment from the national security team. That we will continue to implement that strategy.
To die before implementing them in that case.
I think, Jackie, that's in no way a fair statement or accusation, I guess, if that's what that is. What we have done and what the president has done is unite countries around the world on a strong package that will be crippling to the Russian economy. And we have done that in a way where we have stood up for the territorial integrity of Ukraine and stood with our NATO partners and allies. It has always been up to President Putin and Russia to determine which path they were going to take. That has not changed, but that leadership on the world stage is what has led to a united front and united opposition to these actions. And I would also note that regardless of what decision President Putin decides to make, one of his intended objectives, I think, as we've seen out there, is to divide NATO. The opposite has happened, to divide maybe the United States and divide leadership in the United States. The opposite has happened. So if that was his objective, he's already not achieving that. Go ahead, Patsy.
A question on Iran. Earlier this week, more than 170 House Republicans wrote a letter to President Biden essentially saying that any new nuclear deals with Iran will meet the same fate as the 2015 JCPOA, meaning that the next Republican administration will just nullify it. Does the administration agree with this assessment, and are you concerned that this may create further complication in the talks in Vienna, which some are saying optimistically could wrap up in mere weeks?
Well, let me say first on the talks in Vienna, they continue to be in the 8th round. It's a long round, I guess we could say. We feel substantial progress has been made in the last week and is continuing to be made, but nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed. If Iran shows seriousness, we can and should reach an understanding on mutual return to full implementation of the JCPOA within days. Anything much beyond that would put the possibility of return to the deal at grave risk. While I'm not certainly going to predict or what it would look like in a future Republican administration, what I think is an important reminder to everyone, regardless of your political affiliation, is what happened over the last 4 years after the former president pulled out of the deal, which means we know what happened, which is we lost complete visibility into their capabilities. They made a significant amount of progress, leaving us at the point we are at today, and put us in a very difficult position in order, as we try to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. So regardless of your politics, hopefully people will factor that in as we look ahead.
To the letter?
I don't have any information on the letter.
On Afghanistan, just real quick.
Sure.
There's continued fighting between the Taliban and the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, which Russia has offered to mediate. Do you have any reaction on both the conflict as well as Moscow's offer?
I'll check with our national security team and see if we can get more. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jen.
Front.